Hey everybody, today I am speaking with Curtis Yarvin, a 48-year-old Berkeley-based intellectual and software designer who has become, I guess, famous in some ways, infamous in other ways, depending on where you sit, as a philosopher of the neo-reactionary or dark enlightenment movement, who's been credited by the New Republic and Vox and other places for kind of inspiring Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance with some of their more extreme ideas around monarchy and technocracy and kind of the necessity of shifting from democracy to something that's more authoritarian or autocratic. So I met Curtis at Hereticon, an event in Miami put on by Founders Fund, Peter Thiel's venture fund. And yeah, I mean, I have very different opinions or ideas about many things, as Curtis does, and therefore it was interesting to have this dialogue with him. I hope you enjoy it. We went on for quite a while. Sometimes it was a little bit abrasive because I found he was very given to monologues, and it was sometimes hard for me to sort of break through his communication style. And I had to do it a bit forcefully. But I hope the ideas went out, and I look forward to what you think in the comments. And please, if you like this type of content or want to see more of it, please subscribe and like and all that good stuff. And yeah, hope to see you soon. I am here with the controversial thinker Curtis Yarvin, also sometimes known by his pseudonym Mencius Goldbug. Is that right?
Moldbug, Manxious
Um,
moldbug. That's and typically known to the police under that name.
how did you come up with that name, by the way? The pseudonym.
I was using one of those handles as one of those names as a handle on one back when I used to post in comment sections back. You remember this thing we had? It was like late 90s, early 2000s. It was called the web. We had this thing called the web, and there were these blogs. I don't know if you remember this. There were these blogs that people had on their web, and they would leave comments on other people's blogs.
Yeah.
This was like before Twitter. It's hard to describe, but I used to comment. I was a poster and I was a comment poster, and I used to comment under those two names. And so I decided to put them together and make it memorable. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you and I maybe came a little bit from those early days of internet culture. I was part of like these communities called like Echo in New York and The Thing, which was
Mhm.
art theory one. They're all text-based and you know,
Yeah, BBS is basically we on Usenet looked down on BBS culture. We felt that it was inferior, but maybe we're wrong. I don't know.
yeah.
Certainly for the right BBS, I'm sure it was a very fine BBSs. It just
And we met, I guess, a week or so ago at Hereticon in
a
Miami.
couple weeks at least, yeah.
Yeah.
Couple weeks at least, yeah.
What was kind of your perspective? What's your perspective on Hereticon? Did you enjoy it? Did you think it was a useful event?
Yeah, it was fun. It's a party. I don't know. People go to parties, you meet other people. Like, it's a cool event, it's cool people, cool location.
Yeah.
Love Miami.
It didn't feel that like joyful to me or exuberant somehow. It felt like very contained. Would you say that was the case? I mean, compared to let's say like
That's an interesting question. Like, you know, that's an interesting question. I suppose that the problem with becoming joyful or exuberant when you kind of are led through. Are Daniel, you must be familiar with the metaphor of Plato's cave. Yeah, can I assume that all of your watchers know about Plato's cave, or maybe they've been to Plato's cave? And it turns out, the thing about Plato's cave that Plato doesn't mention is that there's like layers to it. So you find the tunnel at the back of Plato's cave and you get out and you're like, oh my God, the sun. I'm looking at the sun. But it's not the sun, it's just a brighter fire. And then you have to find the next tunnel and so forth. And when you actually emerge at the surface, I'm speaking metaphorically here, of course, we don't actually live underground. But when you emerge at the surface, it's like it's depressing. It's like scary. Like the surface is like kind of more, it's a little too much reality in a way. Do you know the E.M. Forster story, The Machine Stops?
I do. I love that story.
It's an amazing, amazing story. It's so prescient. And, Ian Forster, as far as I'm aware, did not really write much, science fiction. He kind of, concentrated on the like mildly gay, like merchant ivory production kind of market, as far as I'm aware. A very sensitive writer, but of course he writes this. And should I summarize The Machine Stops for your, or does this is very erudite blog. People
Go
know.
for it.
Okay. So okay, I'll go for it. So the plot of The Machine Stops is just it's incredibly prescient. Sorry, I'm going to I'm clipping a little bit here, I think. It's incredibly prescient because basically in the world of The Machine Stops, for reasons that are unclear, everyone lives kind of underground in like little compartments, and all of their needs are taken care of by a giant worldwide machine. So, for example, they Zoom with each other. This is like 1903 or something. So they're Zooming with each other and kind of living spread around the world, and they're, transported by all this stuff. And, everything is run by a giant sort of computerized world. And of course, the plot of The Machine Stops is that this machine is breaking down and no one knows how to fix it. And everyone on the planet are these like kind of Wall-E victims where they just live in this. And there's sort of a rumor that out there on the surface, they're like barbarian people living in the wild, but how barbaric must they be, right? And fabulous, fabulous story with enormous relevance to the way we live now. And
So
so,
you'd say the
yeah, so my point is that when you're living inside the sort of, the very comforting information space that you and I grew up in, listening to National Public Radio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can I do my impression? This is John Hockenberry for National Public Radio. And the like and you grow up inside that world, and it's very like comfortable in a way. I mean, there are certain like scary things about it. There are bugbears that you need to be afraid of. But it's like when you get outside of that box and you can sort of look at it from the outside, from what I would call like a historical perspective, the historical perspective is kind of wilder and more bleak and really doesn't kind of lead really to any optimism. Moreover, the thing is that I would say that most of the people, say, for example, a hereticon, are honestly, and I say this with all the love in my heart, they're not as pilled as me. And so,
no,
the
what? Sorry,
problem is
they're not.
they're not as pilled as me.
Okay.
And because they're, I think I have to say, since I'm the one that stole the metaphor from the Wachowskis, I would say most people are not as pilled as me. And so when you're not as pilled as me, it's like as the layers of reality like unravel, you have to become more and more like pessimistic. Like, who's really excited right now? Who's really excited right now is Elon Musk, because Elon like thinks he's won in some incredible sense. And I'm just like, I do not think of Elon as a person who's very, very pilled at all. He's kind of a 90s libertarian. And that 90s libertarianism gives him this extraordinary sense of optimism, like he's already like done the political equivalent of like reaching Mars or something. And actually he's done the political equivalent of like I don't know, standing on a step ladder to
Okay.
and falling off of it.
Hold on. Let's reel back a little bit.
Let's reel back a little bit.
Yeah. So let's just.
So the world is actually very grim from a based perspective.
Okay.
And that's why people aren't super happy to like be seeing these things.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just sort of like talk about. Can you give us like I mean, maybe like a précis of what your sort of core beliefs and ideas are?
Wow,
Like a
my
like a
core
2 minute
beliefs
like
and
I mean
ideas.
people describe you as a
This
monarchist or a neo-cameralist. It's
mhm.
a term that's used. I mean, I guess yeah. I mean, I'm intrigued. I guess I think you and I are in some ways similar. Like we have similar backgrounds. We have completely different political ideologies and spiritual ideologies and so on. So it's kind of intriguing that we're coming from in some ways overlapping heritages, yet we've arrived at very different perspectives. I think both of us, you, I would say much more than me at this point, are, a little bit what Buckminster Fuller called trim tabs. Like ideas have like a very strange way of, moving through a culture or through a society, right? Like, when I wrote my first book, Breaking Open the Head, nobody was talking about psychedelics or taking it seriously. But
Hmm.
the book was like
I
a little,
remember I remember what it was like, because I read let's see, when did I get my copy of Peak Hall? It must have been 1994.
yeah.
So, and then I read his the sort of the Shulgin story is so inspiring, it's such a great book, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I remember what that scene was like in the early 90s, right? And it's certainly changed somewhat since then. I would say,
Certainly.
well, let me do this a little differently. Okay,
Hmm.
can I do this a little differently than I usually different? Because, my general impression, Daniel, not to sort of put it in pejorative terms, but I get the impression most of your audience is what we sometimes call libs, libs. Libs. Or sometimes, have you heard the term? I hate to mention this. You've heard the term shit lib? It's like this, like, Rethuglican. Shit lib is like the right wing version of like Rethuglican, or these like really like you'll see this kind of really low rent political discourse on like Blue Sky or Gab or something. But libs, would you say that most of your audience is libs?
Yeah, I mean, I would sure. I don't know. I haven't polled my
Okay.
audience on that, but I would say a lot of them
Okay, but
are more
yeah, the generally libs.
progressive,
Okay, so
progressive camp.
yeah,
Like we
progressive,
like.
sure, sure.
I would say that we like social programs. We're
How do you
diversity
feel?
type
How do you
people.
feel
Things
about?
like
How
that.
do you feel when I say the name? Just I'm about to say a name, and I want you before I say the name. I want you to focus on feeling the emotional valence of this name. Okay, from one very, very negative to 10 very, very positive. Okay, are you prepared, just like emotionally, spiritually,
I'm
for this name
sort of
response?
prepared, but I also kind of want to like run. Like if we're gonna have like a bit of a podcast,
Okay, yeah,
I
yeah,
want
yeah,
to kind of
yeah.
run
That's all
it
right.
in the
That's
way
all
that I
right.
kind of
I'm
want to
I'm
run
kind
it.
of yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
because
yeah. Let
otherwise we're
me
just going
let
to keep
me
butting heads. So I mean, I asked you a simple question.
let me run the start. I'm answering
Yeah.
the question in a way. Okay, so if you're prepared to do this little experiment with me, try the name Franklin Delano Roosevelt. One
Yeah,
to 10.
actually, in preparation for talking with you today, I watched your interview with Cenk Uygur. How do you pronounce his name anyway?
Cenk. He's Turkish.
And I
Cenk.
liked it. I mean, it was, it was very
Uh,
respectful, but I actually felt that he made a number of very strong, counter arguments that I didn't feel you really had much of a real response to. And I recommend
we can
that
definitely go, but
it's
can you
on
give me
YouTube.
can you give
So
me can you give me an FDR number? Like, what's your?
yeah, I mean, I don't really give a fuck at this point, to be honest, about FDR, but it could be a seven. It seems like he
It could
accomplished
be a
some nice
seven.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, he accomplished some nice things. So on the scale, now, if I were to say to you, FDR was, let's choose one of several epithets. I could say that he was a great American leader.
No.
Correct. Okay, I would say that he was a dictator. I would say, or you could say, agree, disagree. You could say that
Disagree.
he was a monarch.
Yeah, disagree.
Okay.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say that he was a monarch. And so the thing is, okay, so in a way, that's definitely a matter of opinion. And let's specifically, FDR has different roles at different times. So let's say FDR in 1942.
Yeah.
So FDR in 1942 or Churchill in 1942 is, I think you would agree, pretty close to unilateral control of the US government.
Sure, but I mean, I think that is something that happens in high stress situations. It's what is the exemption or the exception
The
where
exception. Okay.
there's a life and death emergency to a society, and if it falls that somebody can handle that pressure and steps into that role, it often becomes powerful. I mean, it is quite interesting how history moves through individualities and personalities at certain points. But,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
you're not going to really. As I said, I already sort of clocked this kind of argument from the Cenk Ugyar. discussion.
Technocratic, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
And
so
yeah, and so
it,
in a way, the conclusion that I think you draw from that is basically that you look at, these, you can look at figures in American history, FDR, Lincoln, Washington, who had pretty much the power over Washington, D.C. that, say, Tim Cook has over Apple.
yeah,
Where Tim Cook is accountable, he can't order Apple to start putting bombs in all their iPads and like blow them up. But he if he goes crazy, like he won't, be in charge. Actually, who's not accountable? Here are two people who are not accountable to any kind of corporate governance. Are you ready for these names? Mark Zuckerberg and A.G. Sulzberger. So, one of the things we observe about the New York Times, for which you, I believe, have written, is that if you look at the governance structure of the New York Times, this is the most trustworthy institution on earth, according to just about everyone. The governance structure of the New York Times is that of a fifth generation hereditary monarchy. And so, the thing is, basically,
I mean,
my point is that when you
yeah,
come,
but I also agree
yeah.
with Cenk Uyghur's pushback, which is like, yeah, it's actually kind of messed up. Like they often, get trapped in, all sorts of, slagging off certain, forces in society, or, it's not that good that it's a hereditary monarchy,
Well,
actually.
that is actually like that is the take that I expected you to have, and the thing is, I think actually
Hmm.
AG by Salzburger standards is a relatively weak king. I think that in particular, when you looked at 2020, so AG had many situations where he was kind of forced to choose between the historical standards of the New York Times and the pressure of his staff, and I think he gave in to the pressure of his staff. And if you look at basically, and I think it's notable also that if you basically go into the past and you look at the great press barons of America, whether you're looking at the Sulzbergers or McCormick
Yeah.
in Chicago, or who was the family that ran the LA Times, the Chandler family that ran the LA Times, I think what you see is that actually in terms of his ability to like basically literally manage the newsroom. I think that Sulzberger is really unique. I think that,
Yeah,
if you look at what happened to the
yeah,
Post
yeah,
when Bezos
yeah,
tried to overrule the newsroom about a tiny cosmetic thing,
right.
everyone was just like, screw you,
Well,
Jeff.
it wasn't seen as so cosmetic, but just to kind of extrapolate, I mean, just because I'm trying to sort of summarize your perspective, maybe for people who don't know your work as of yet.
Yeah,
Your perspective is this type of CEO type governance, like a tech company, like Tim Cook, or Zuckerberg, would be the preferable model for a country like the United States, in the way it kind of is in a country like Saudi Arabia or Russia or China. Those would be better
or
models.
China.
Those would be better models.
So what I observe is that when I look at any large organization, I see that basically by far the most competitive form of governance there is a monarchy, what I call an accountable monarchy, which is a monarchy whose sort of results are in a way accountable to some kind of body, whether it's a board of directors or, as in China, the Chinese Communist Party, or here, if the president was really the CEO of the government, he could be unelected every 4 years. And but sometimes you see monarchies without this, like the Salzburgers or like Mark Zuckerberg, with these kind of, I don't want to get into the details, but in any case, what you see is like the exercise that I ask people to perform somewhere is to basically look around you and basically point to everything in the room that was made by a monarchy or in a monarchy or both. For example, I am looking right now at a MacBook Pro. That MacBook Pro says designed by Apple in California, made in China. So Apple is a monarchy, China is a monarchy, California is not a monarchy. And if we asked the government of California to make a MacBook Pro, God only knows what they would produce, but it wouldn't be very impressive. And so we normally, if you're a libertarian, you basically are like, well, I'm not a libertarian. If you're a libertarian, you're like, uh-huh, the private sector works and the public sector doesn't. Government has violated the non-aggression principle. Sorry, doing my libertarian impression. I won't, I assume that probably most of your readers are not quite as fond of libertarians. And
Some of them are
are they driving up
libertarians.
the
I think we have some overlap.
some of them are libertarians. Okay, so sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I pretended to do a libertarian. I'm a member of Mensa. And I'm not a member of Mensa. And in any case, if you are a member of Mensa, you understand logic. And if you understand logic, and you basically think this is the difference between the public sector and the private sector, I would encourage you to see the recent film Oppenheimer. And when we see the film Oppenheimer, which I would quarrel with a few historical details of it, which is basically accurate, you notice a couple of things about the Manhattan Project. One is it's a government program. Two is it is probably the most effective engineering project of all time. Next to I don't think the MacBook Pro really can cast any shade on the Manhattan Project. Third, it seems to be entirely run by communists. And because one of the things that they portray in Oppenheimer, I mean, I think they really soft pedal Oppenheimer himself's involvement with the party. But one of the things that you see that's absolutely real about the milieu that Oppenheimer is operating in is everybody smart or cool is a communist. Okay. So ask me basically if your theory as a libertarian is it basically things are efficient because they're in the private sector and they're done by people who believe in capitalism. Tell me why the Manhattan Project works so well as a government program. Tell me why the Apollo program works so well as a government program. The Apollo project, one of the other, basically great engineering projects of all time. That wasn't even a product of capitalism. That was a product of Nazism. Literally, the Apollo program is the Nazi space program with like hundreds of scientists, including the director, moved to Alabama. It was actually Nazis who put a man on the moon, right? So the thing is, this idea that like the American system of capitalism is like the only way that you can get anything done is kind of obviously wrong.
Hmm.
And so when you look at, what exactly is the difference between NASA today and the Apollo program as led by Dr. Wende von Braun, or if you look at, what is the difference between actually the Manhattan Project's lineal descendant exists in Washington today. My mother worked for it. It's called the Department of Energy. And so when your question is basically what is the thing where basically Apple and the Manhattan Project are on one side of the line, and the Department of Energy and the California Department of Transportation are on the other side of that line, that is the line of monarchy versus oligarchy. Does that make sense so far? I can go into a little more detail about what that means.
It seems like your idea is we would have, something like a dictator or a mon or a ruler who had fairly much unilateral and autocratic power over society. And
So
we see that in countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia right now. Would you prefer to live in Saudi Arabia or Russia than to live in the US right
we
now?
also see it in places like Elizabethan England and the France of
But
Louis the
that's
14th.
kind of
And if I
Elizabeth in England also was quite
and so here's
many
the thing,
many years.
here's the thing.
Elizabeth, so I don't want to keep talking over each other. We're gonna have to
Yeah,
figure out a little
yeah.
bit about because when you get going, you're on a big stream. So I'm gonna try to interrupt
All right,
everything.
hit me,
I mean,
hit
there are
me.
obviously different conditions, and also in contemporary, post-industrial, hyper-technological society, the ruler has a lot more potential capacity to control and surveil than Elizabeth did back in Elizabeth, England. So my question for you, would you actually prefer to live in a country like Saudi Arabia, where your freedom to think, your freedom to express yourself is highly limited? Because isn't that kind of where
So
we're heading here if we see the rise of Project 25 and the sort
how
of
much?
implementation of this sort of Christian nationalist project? Isn't that what we end up with here, very likely, in 5 to 10 years?
No, I think you're basically taking your enemy's fantasies and making them your own. So two things. One, if you look at how much do you know about Elizabethan England? Like, Shakespeare, you probably read some Shakespeare, like you're down with that.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I was in history classes. It's a beautiful period, and she
it's a
happened
beautiful,
she happened to be a good queen. But the thing is that, and we discussed this a little bit before on text and so on.
yeah.
In a system where somebody has absolute power, and as I said, now absolute power is a hell of a lot different than it was back then. If that goes off the rails, then everybody is completely screwed. And the other thing about it, and I'm sure you know this, it's like cultures like Saudi Arabia and Russia and China have a fear component over them. People do not feel they have the capacity to speak, to express themselves, to gather in public places, to protest. Is that actually what you think is better here? Is that what you think is better for human society?
Well, two things. One is that there are some people here who have that freedom and other people who don't.
Well,
And,
who is that?
it depends.
Who's
It
the distinction?
depends.
What's the
It
distinction?
depends what you're,
Who is the one
it,
who has the freedom and who is the one who don't?
so if you compare, for example, the treatment of J6 protesters to J20 protesters, you'll see some pretty wide disparities. And when you basically look at, for example, who is in practice free or unfree to speak in the public square. I think, there was a long time. Do you remember net neutrality? Were you into net neutrality? It's sort of funny to look back and remember like net neutrality and, sort of the fear of the like American left that they're going to be like censored in some way as it was like 1955. And actually in 1955, they didn't really have anything to be afraid of either. These things sort of look very different from when you look at them from the other side. But I mean, how many people are getting sent to jail right now for tweets in the UK? Like they're a little bit ahead of us, but they're not very ahead of us. You've seen that. You've seen that going on. You've seen the guys who, went to jail for 2 years in the UK for stickers. That's just a little more advanced than we are here, But of course, if you look in the UK, let's look at the UK at the difference in the
Well, there,
treatment
there are also people.
between.
There are also
But
people. There are
wait.
also people
Can I
going. There are
finish? Can
also
I
people going
finish?
to. There are also people going to
Look
jail.
at the difference
There are also
between the
people going to
treatment.
jail in the UK for great periods of time because of ecological protests.
Yeah, so you had basically like two people who actually like damaged a painting, and they basically did this like
Well,
people glue themselves. Wait,
they didn't actually damage a painting.
yeah,
They threw on a glass. Those were
sure. They
fairly recent
participated in
protests.
this
Those
in
are
this
actually
like
damaging anything of
media.
value.
They participated in a media stunt, and a judge had enough. Now imagine if the same people glued themselves to the road to basically, protest the presence of Somalis in the UK. Imagine that they vandalized basically the multicultural exhibits in the British Museum. Imagine how hard they would get the book thrown at them. Then look at the treatment of the people after the recent riots, very similar to J6 treatment, people going to multiple jail for multiple years for
Okay,
comments on Twitter.
so you're making
Wait,
you're making the
wait.
distinction. You're making the distinction that from your perspective, people who express a right-wing ideology up until now have been more stigmatized and more oppressed in certain respects than those who
Not only is
have a
that
liberal
not only is
ideology.
that true now, not only is that true now, I got in trouble. I drove away Kevin Spacey at the Hereticon ball. My friend Maria was so mad because she's a huge Kevin Spacey fan. And I drove Kevin Spacey away by talking about the Hollywood 10. And he was just
Oh, I thought you
like
meant you
talked
like drove
about,
him away in a car. I didn't know you drove him away.
no. I alienated him. He did not want to talk to me anymore. When he waxed, poetic about the suffering of the Hollywood 10. And I was like, the Hollywood 10 were actually the leaders of the CPUSA in Hollywood, which had turned Hollywood screenwriting into a closed union shop for the CPUSA. You've probably seen Hail Caesar.
Yeah.
And, it's not a documentary, but you get it.
I
But
want to
like,
yeah. I want to back up a little bit because the two things that I first just wanted to establish for the
mhm,
listeners, whoever they are. One was just your basic framework in certain terms of your ideas, which I know includes the red pilling you mentioned, the cathedral,
mhm.
neo-cameralism or monarchism, or actually that an absolutist kind of let's say dictatorship, you want to say, or CEO led
So
society would
yeah.
be
So
more
there's a
advantageous than what we have right now.
There's a basic confusion that people have because they believe in this fundamentally stupid idea, the stupid American idea of limited government. Actually, there's no such thing as limited government. There's anarchy, which is incapable government. You see that in like Haiti today. But there's no such thing as limited government anywhere ever. Sovereignty is conserved. What you mean when you say limited government is just that the is just divided government. You just have multiple different powers. If all of those powers agree, if the Supreme Court orders you, to stand on your head and shave your balls, you will stand on your head and shave your balls. And so to say that there's one party that in some cases pushes back against other parties, such is true always. And there's basically this kind of fundamental American mistake of basically it's actually in classical political science, it's called imperium and imperio, which means basically conflicting paths of authority. I mean, you can easily imagine what kind of computer would be using this on if Apple was governed by a Supreme Court, a legislature, and and a powerless president. So what you
I mean,
see when you see basically when you talk about limited government, you're basically you are not saying that the state does not have the power to knock on your door right now, today, and send you to Guantanamo. It's not supposed to send you to Guantanamo, but it could. And so the thing is, you have certain levels of protection against that. I have certain other levels of protection against that. But these are all like, what we see in the case of this crazy Trump lawfare is that, if you have a judge, you can do anything. And a judge is just a guy in a black robe.
obviously, it's imperfect, but the whole point is that there's something called the rule of law, right? Rather than just the rule of power. And the rule of
And
law.
how does that law rule? Does it express itself through men in special clothing or men or women in special clothing?
Well, I
Like
mean,
what
it expresses itself through hundreds of years of interactivity,
yes, which hundreds of years of
constitutions, amendments,
interactivity,
laws, legal codes. There are protections.
which these people can simply ignore.
Well,
And
anybody can
they
simply ignore it. We can ask ourselves, and I think it's an open discussion, who's ignoring it more for what purposes, whether it's actually the quote unquote liberal or the shit libs, whatever you call them, or if it's more perhaps the right wing, more eager to
yeah,
ignore.
well, the I mean, the thing is, what's amazing about this
But
country is that
I'm
basically,
just trying to get you to
oh,
sum
go on.
up. I'm just trying to get you to sum up, like, the core beliefs and core ideas in like a minute or two that you believe are really essential, that you want to project into the world.
All right.
You
The
have to
sovereignty
project into the
is
world very
sovereign,
effectively.
sovereign, sovereignty is conserved. All governments are absolute. There is no such thing as freedom in any sense. Your only choice, democracy is not really an option, especially when the people are as weak as they are. Your only choices are between monarchy and oligarchy, which is to say, dictatorship and bureaucracy. Those
Okay.
are your only choices.
Now,
And
okay. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
so if you prefer bureaucracy to dictatorship, that's great. Go with what we have now. You should be
I
aware that
definitely
bureaucracy,
prefer bureaucracy to dictatorship. 100% prefer that.
you should be aware that bureaucracies tend to deteriorate over time.
And
You
so do
basically,
dictatorships.
Well, the thing is, a dictatorship is also called a monarchy. What we're really looking at when we look at a dictatorship, two things. I want to go back to your point about Saudi Arabia and Russia, because actually, when we basically look at examples from monarchy in the 20th century, this is a very, very, very strange set of monarchies, because all of these monarchies, since Napoleon, and including really Napoleon, are basically competing against Anglo-American world power. And so they all have this element of being rebellions against a larger international order. And so that feeling of basically being Louis the 14th, or even Elizabeth the First felt a little besieged. Louis the 14th, after he defeated the Fronde, did not feel besieged at all. And it's that sense, what creates the sense, it's like when you talk about, say, infringing the freedom of speech, Frederick the Great, one of my favorite monarchs had this great line about the freedom of the press. He said, "They say what they want, and I do what I want." Amazing, amazing monarch. Really, really fabulous. And like and so when you look at these horrid 20th century monarchies, they come out of, they come from strange sources. Like China's very successful monarchy, has to emerge from like Maoism, which is this insane 20th century phenomenon. There's nothing like Nazism, Maoism, Stalinism. These are 20th century phenomena. We don't see them previously in European history at all. And so understanding why this century is special and dangerous and scary, especially when we look at, the average monarchy in it, is like we just don't see anything like Hitler before the 20th century. And the closest things we do see to these kind of outbreaks of like, mass homicidal savagery, really that starts in like the reign of terror in the late 18th century, and that's a very much a left-wing phenomenon. And so, to think of this sort of rebirth of barbarism in late European society as like, to me, all of this is an epiphenomenon of the revolutionary age. These
Mhm.
are, and so, that's why when we look, for example, even at like someone like Bukele in El Salvador, who's just revolutionized that nation, and like just the amount of liberty that Bukele has created in El Salvador by becoming a dictator is absurd. Like people, you can go read the New York Times on it, read The Economist on it. It's like people are like, wow, I can like walk across town now and not be killed. I walked around the main square of the old district of El Salvador carrying a laptop
Right.
in my hand.
This is kind of like,
And so like,
isn't this like
that's an enormous creation of freedom.
the trade-off is between freedom and security? That for you is the big.
No, I think the trade-off is not between freedom and security, because I think that in El Salvador people have much more of both. Their freedom is greatly, as I like when 40% of Americans, and this is a recent Gallup poll, when 40% of Americans are physically afraid to walk outside their homes at night. Okay, that's demented.
Yeah,
And like you
as
can
I said.
say, well, they've been Fox News is programmed to be them to be afraid. Oh my God, have you read? It's like when I read the way crime used to be reported in this country. Though my favorite example is I was in a used bookstore about 20 years ago, and I'm reading basically like the Napa Valley Journal.
Mhm.
Okay, the Napa Valley Journal from like May of 1940. And like, the German Panzer divisions are slicing through France. And that is obviously the top headline in the Napa Valley Journal. And then you scroll, you look down the page, and you see on the front page someone in Fresno passed a bad check and he's suspected of having come to Napa. Like the level of tolerance in like old-fashioned pre-war American society for like crime and disorder was comparable to the level of tolerance you see in Japan today, which is none. You can leave your laptop on the subway in Japan and get it back. And as long as it can be tracked to you in some ways, you get it back. And so, that's a tremendous freedom. Have you been to Japan? You must have been to Japan.
I've only been.
You feel,
I haven't been to Japan. I've
like,
only been to the airport pretty much. But okay, but I just want to like go into a few questions here. Actually, I'll ask you this question. I have a friend who I've been working with who came up with a bunch of questions for you that I thought were very
oh,
interesting.
excellent.
Okay. Okay, let's assume that monarchy is a pathway that we need to go in order to rein in the elites. Would you say that's one of the main ideas for we have
Well,
this.
reigning in the elites is a tough question, because the thing is, I think that a lot of Americans, especially Trump voters, kind of, don't really want to admit the eliteness of the elites. And I don't think that's where you want to go with that. And like, because when I go to a gathering of American elites, honestly, I love these people. Like they're my people. Like I can, like hang with them all night long. I can give them, engage them in interesting political discourse as long as I'm kind of careful about that. I love our American elites. The problem is they're just like, it's not, and I love even my parents worked in the deep state. Like my father was a senior foreign service officer. Like I know the deep state, not because I worked there myself, but I grew up inside the deep state. These are great people. It's like the structures that don't work. It's the structures that basically take this enormous volume of like great, great people and produce this incredibly bumbling, inept, dangerously incompetent government.
Okay, so I mean, I'm in the discussion with Schenk, where he sort of, I think, came around and you sort of agreed was that the problem with instituting dictatorship is, you get sort of one shot at it, and if it's the wrong person, then you're, super, super screwed, right? And you were,
So when you look at where that's a sort of a reasonable fear in some ways, and then but when you cut off history before 1900 and you say basically, you know, the genetic lottery, like with hereditary monarchy, which is not necessarily the best form of monarchy, although it's pretty common and it works pretty well. I'm a big fan of if you know the term five good emperors. Gibbon, writing in the on the Roman Empire, identifies the time between God, it was the founder, Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius is basically the best government that man had ever had. Of course, he's writing before the American Revolution, which obviously created a much better government than Marcus Stupid Aurelius. What an idiot, right? I mean, we've all seen what a doofus he is in Gladiator, right? And so, I'm a big fan of that system. They had this sort of weird adoptive succession thing that was actually kind of cool. I looked into it and once, and I'm like, the five good emperors seem like they're adopting like charming young men. Maybe it's actually the five gay emperors. But whatever their sexuality, they delivered amazing government. And then Marcus Aurelius had the bad idea of giving the emperor to Commodus, and we've all seen that movie, right? And although I hear there's a sequel that came out. And so when we look at basically European history, we see certain results from monarchy. When we look at Roman history, we see other kinds of results. And I think that, many of those things sort of relate to, like, you can't separate government from the people, the time, the system, the religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we just don't see, there's a lot of kings in European history. There's a lot of countries, there's a lot of kings, and we see a lot of funky stuff. We see some Borgia kind of activity, but we just don't see anything like Hitler.
one question for you. What would be the legitimacy? What would, I mean, so if you look at, medieval kings or Roman emperors,
hmm
there was a religious, ultimately there was a divine right. There was a sense that the king, had some kind of dispensation on a spiritual level. Now I know that you're basically a committed atheist, so what would give a dictator a legitimacy to the extent that everybody just gives up their freedom to dissent or their freedom to protest and so on up to
Well,
that
yeah, when you use with two
individual.
things, when you use the word freedom, if you've read Hobbes, probably Hobbes is referring to the way freedom is used in his time, which is of course the late 17th century,
Let me
later
just I can give you
17th
a very
century.
I can give you a very specific example from my life.
So,
If I had been living in China or Saudi Arabia and had the spiritual crisis I had when I was young and wanted to write a book about psychedelic drugs, I would not have been able to possibly do that. That would have been completely, I mean, in the US was already a little bit of a push because there was so much social repression around it, but there wasn't like literal repression. So like,
in China,
there's a reason why democratic societies like America, as chaotic as they are also extremely innovative. They produce new and original thought because people aren't forced to correspond to a pyramidical structure with a hierarchical leader at the top. It allows for a lot more innovation, which is a bit chaotic, but is actually much more interesting and humane, and allows for like human ferment and dissent and so on.
Well, okay, multiple things. So one, actually, I think that there's certainly there's a bunch of interesting truths in what you say, and these things are echoed in both of my kind of favorite periods in political science, which are, of course, like ancient Greece and the Victorian era, both of which had very similar kinds of attitudes. And there's no question that, for example, when you look at kind of, even Plato, and Plato is not a big fan of democracy.
No, of course
You
not.
know, Aristotle is not even a big fan of democracy, although he finds it impolitic to be as reactionary as Plato, but Plato is really the ultimate, reactionary. He's really a tyrant, sympathizer, and kind of a Sparta simp, in a way. And but even Plato, acknowledges basically that in especially the sort of the transition from tyranny to democracy, in the sense of like breaking open a system, there's a lot of positive energy in that. And for me, there's a couple of interesting questions about how that positive energy sort of works as effectively as possible. Because again, there was also a lot of positive energy in Frederick the Great's Prussia. There was a lot of positive energy. I mean, Louis the XIV's, France, Elizabeth the First, England. There's an enormous flowering of culture in Elizabeth the First, England, and yet Elizabeth the First has a secret police. Elizabeth the First has censorship. There's a play by Ben Jonson called The Isle of Dogs, which is lost. We actually don't have the play because it contained all of these like satirical references to prominent, figures, and Queen Elizabeth had it banned. And I believe, through the author in the pillory. So, this is actually,
Curtis,
it's a very generative time. It's a more generative time than ours. And yet, for example, in Elizabethan England, as I don't know how exactly it works in Saudi Arabia, but I can imagine in Saudi Arabia, the government has a list of everyone in the country and is like, you have to go to mosque every Friday. Well, guess what? Unless you're an aristocrat in Elizabethan England, it works exactly the same way. The parish priest has a list of people in his congregation, and if they don't show up at church every Sunday, he's like, what the hell?
Curtis, I have a question.
And he has the power to enforce that. And so the thing is that when we see like these correlations in the modern world, if we think that the correlations are causative in this kind of simplistic way, these things should not be true, and yet they're true. And so I think, there's no question that like China and Saudi Arabia are very they're societies that are hostile to the free thinking intellectual in more or less measure. I mean, you could write that book in China, probably be a little hard to publish
You
it,
would
but you
never
could
be able to
certainly
write it.
write it.
You would never be able to write that in
You
China.
could write it.
I
You
have,
could write it. They
I
don't
have
they
another
actually,
question for you. Okay.
yeah,
Have you heard of this book, Unhumans?
no.
Okay. The book is Unhumans, The Secret History of Communist Revolutions and How to Crush Them. Now, both Donald Trump
Wow.
and Vance, J.D.
Who
Vance, blurbed this book positively.
who wrote this book? Who wrote this book?
Uh, Jack Posobiec, the author
Posobiec.
on
Yeah.
this, and
Yeah, yeah,
Stephen
yeah,
Bannon wrote the
yeah.
foreword.
Like I think that basically, because I'm basically a nice person, I haven't met either of these individuals, either Bannon or Posobiec. I definitely know who they are.
But Vance, you haven't met.
I've met Vance. The
He
thing is,
quotes your work. He quotes your ideas.
yeah, but the thing is basically like, there's this sort of feeling that you get in Silicon Valley when like some like big famous person like, invests some penny any amount of money in your stupid ass startup, and you're just like Founders Fund has discovered my genius. And then like Founders Fund goes and invests like 10 times as much money in something you look at and you're like, this is total shit. Right. And so I can't really be responsible for like, I'm probably wrong about that, but I
Yeah.
can't be responsible for, Vance or anyone's opinion of this Pacific. But if you ask me about a specific thing in the book, I'm happy to tell you my
Yeah.
opinion.
So the book basically says that liberals, leftists, certainly socialists and communists are quote unquote not human. Okay. And they don't actually have to be treated in the way
What
humans.
is what is the quote there?
You want me to
They're
pull up the quote?
probably yeah. No, you're reminding me of where the quote comes from. Somebody must have been very inspired by this post-war Polish mercenary named Rafał Gongonowicz. And the problem is they've taken a joke and made it unfunny, which is like classic American rightism. The joke, if I may repeat the joke, can I repeat the joke? I think this is where they got the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, they're basically someone is interviewing Gon Gonovich, and he's like, what does it feel like to take a life? And Gon Gonovich is like, I wouldn't know. Or what is it like to take a human life? And he's like, I wouldn't know. I've only killed communists. And the thing that you know, obviously, if you're a communist, that's not very funny. It reminds me of a joke, though, that an Israeli Air Force officer, kind of in, I think, the kind of Ariel Sharon Lebanon war days, was asked a similar question.
So I found
Um,
I found the quote from Unhumans just to read it to you.
let's hear it.
By becoming consumed by nihilism, unhumans oppose everything that makes up humanity. As they are opposed to humanity itself, they place themselves outside of the category completely in an entirely new misery-driven subdivision, the unhuman. They specifically reject the human rights of others. So if and when they get their way, they will unhuman you too. They convert, and that which they cannot convert, they destroy. So about
Well,
leftists,
when I look at
not finished. About leftists and even Democrats, they talk about them as being completely devoid, as you also say, of genuine compassion or concern for equality or justice. Quote, they don't believe what they say. They don't care about winning debates. They don't even want equality. They just want an excuse to destroy everything. They want an excuse to destroy you. Okay. Now,
well, I think this is an
the
absolutely
book, just to continue, the book praises people like Francisco Franco and Augusto Pinochet. Okay. It says they praise Franco as someone who unified all conservatives, Catholics, and anti-communists under the Make Spain Great Again, a little bit familiar phrase there.
mm,
Okay. So, we know Franco was a fascist dictator who ruled Spain from 1939 until 1975, executed intellectuals, poets like Federico Garcia Lorca, you know. So
oh, wait,
Pinochet,
wait,
threw
yeah,
people out
yeah.
of helicopters.
Lorca's
Pinochet
death
threw
was
his
earlier.
political opponents out of helicopters. So Pinochet offered reciprocal punishment to the communist revolutionaries, demoralizing their cause and diminishing their ranks. All allies of anti-civilization were ruthlessly excised from Chilean society. The story of tossing communists out of helicopters hails from Pinochet's elimination of communism during the mid to late 1970s. Okay,
I think
now
that was more of an
let's see what
Argentina
J.D.
thing,
Vance
actually.
says about the book. Past, communists march in the streets waving red flags. Today, they march through human resource departments, college campuses, and courtrooms to wage lawfare against good, honest people. And on humans, Jack Posobiec and Josua Lusek reveal their plans and show us what to do to fight back.
Yeah, I mean the like I think that there's a style in, you know, I don't think that's a very I think a pretty good of what I would call the American progressive mind. And I can, you know,
To read you Donald
and
Trump's quote
I
about the book. The far left murdered 100 million people in the 20th century and repeatedly shown they will stop at nothing to achieve their totalitarian goals. They have torn down countless societies using a sophisticated playbook of propaganda. The only way to stop them in the future is to use their own subversive playbook against them. Unhumans reveals that playbook and teaches us how to deploy it immediately to save the West. Donald Trump Jr.
So it's certainly true that far leftists killed 100 million people in the
Yes,
20th
for sure.
century, and so far rightists did rack up a certain level of body count
Yeah, they certainly
themselves,
did.
and the like, sort of no one's. heritage really emerges in a way from that century is all like, there's this line from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that I really love, where I'm curious just what you think of this line. He says, "The line between good and evil runs through every human heart."
Yes, of course.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so the thing is that basically, like, I find that, I understand where that picture of communism comes from. I personally, actually, I own a Che Guevara shirt.
Also,
Can I
liberal
tell you that?
Democrats, not just communists, liberal Democrats, they're saying. Another
Well,
question for
so
you. You're
mhm.
supporting, as far as I understand it, this movement towards Trump and Vanceism and whatever it's going to become. And behind that is, Opus Dei, a lot of religious fundamentalism, anti-abortion, which I know you don't support. So you're an atheist. Don't you have a little bit of fear of what's going to happen if the religious right truly get their hands on the levels of power in the US?
I used to,
What do you
I
think about
grew
the
up,
separation of church and state? How is that going to work out in your proposed monarchy?
so I grew up, it's a good question. I grew up worried about the moral majority. Remember the moral
I
majority? The
do.
moral majority was, Tipper Gore, the band Tipper Gore,
Yes, of
parental
course. I
warnings, like
remember.
80s, do you remember, did you actually see the frying pan commercial? Say no to drugs with your brain, like frying like an egg. Do you remember those Dare
Yes, of
commercials?
course.
Okay, 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 okay. Yes, sorry. I'm like, yeah, when I think of those commercials, I always think of there was a boss I had in the 90s where I was a young engineer in my
I just
my
want to make
20s and
one
30s.
quick point, Curtis.
Yes.
I loved your comment about the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. So don't we, as thinkers and intellectuals, have a sort of moral responsibility to promote the good side of that? The
Our moral
rather than promoting the
responsibility,
evil side.
our moral responsibility as, I sometimes describe myself. I don't like the word historian because it seems to involve some kind of credentials. I sometimes think of myself as a student of history, but the thing is, student is really too inadequate a word. I'm more like, history doesn't need to be studied in a way. It's just like when you sense the immensity of all of these human lives and human experiences, you realize that you're not really studying history, you're actually worshiping history. And until you come to it with this level of attitude of respect, I think you're doing it a disservice. And what I would say specifically to Posobiec and Bannon is I think that basically writing that way about American progressivism, liberalism, socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it,
Liberal
it's really all the
Democrats,
same.
Democrats
And
also, they make it very
and
clear.
and and when you there's no line anywhere, right? And when you want to basically write the story of that, what I tell everyone to do is like shut up with this. I mean, yes, I was about to say something nasty. What I want to say is the
Okay,
thing to
that's,
do
that's
if you're
fine.
thinking like
I'm
this,
really
the
curious as
thing
to
to
like
no,
the
no, no, I
problem.
wasn't saying something nasty to you. I was saying something nasty to them. Okay, I don't want to say anything nasty to anyone. What I basically want to tell people to do is like, recognize that when you're talking about the dead people of the 1930s, like you need that as a student of history, you need that basically level of almost worshipful full respect. And until you apply that to communists, you're not going to understand communism. And not understanding communism is like, why are you even bothering? Your whole point of a book like that is try to help people understand communists and communism. And I'm like, okay, the first thing you need to do, what I would say to Jack Posobiec, if he was sitting right here in the room with me right now, after reading a book like that, as I would say, okay. you need to sit down and study American communism in a totally different way than you're studying it right now. And you need to take an entire freaking weekend. Here is a website you should read. It is called Marxist.org. And on it, they have the entire archive of the New Masses, which is an incredible magazine from the 1930s.
We talked about this a bit.
Read that, read that,
I
read
also,
that, live inside it, absorb its
yeah,
worldview. And
my
then you'll be able to say something about these people.
okay. Well, they are saying something about those people, and what they're saying,
Well, but they're not
they're going to
not
be
in a way. But here's the
scapegoated.
thing. Here's the
Okay,
thing. Here's the thing, Daniel.
they're going to be
Here's the thing.
scapegoated for what happens here.
When you here's the problem. This is the reason why they basically feel they have an excuse to write and think in this historically illiterate way. They kind of don't know any better. And they don't know any better because, I'm sorry to say that basically the way most people think about Franco or Pinochet or Mussolini or Hitler or even Stalin or any of these regimes has a similar paper thin and cardboard quality. And the thing is, it's like basically you don't really, if you think of, Franco, even the Nazis, if you think of them as these caricatures from a Marvel movie, you're basically doing the same thing as Posobiec and Bannon. You're really like, you're just not, you don't have the vibe of history. Like, and like when you get the vibe of history, like you're basically like you sort of see the level of like pure tragedy that sort of like the 20th century is just a tragedy beyond the imagining of Shakespeare.
It might
And
be
like, and that is a different,
my perspective is we're heading into worse tragedy, and I'm very concerned.
no,
Again, well, I
no,
mean, when you
no.
look at, for instance, and I know we don't agree about this, anthropogenic climate change and the impact it's likely to have in the next 5 to 10 years. We're looking at, I would say, many millions of climate refugees. I would say that one reason for the growth of global right-wing populism right now is actually
Can
climate
I,
change.
can I, can I make a recommendation? Can I make a recommendation to you, which is similar to my recommendation for Jack Posobiec and so forth? What I would recommend is basically it was around 1995 or so that, of course, you can get older. Do you have a LexisNexis subscription?
I do not.
Okay. And since you do not, you will have to rely on like shitty public domain tools, essentially. Basically, so as it happens, I know something about this because not to share any secrets here, but my own dear mother worked at the Department of Energy and Environmental Efficiency in the 80s. And she worked specifically with a guy named Joe Romm, ROMM, who, if you don't know the name, was sort of the Anthony Fauci of climate change in terms of being like,
Yeah,
so
the second question that I meant to ask you, the first question being
yeah,
just a sort of, kind of like, kind of
let
concept.
me let me share
But I just
my
want to say it was a little bit
recommendation.
about your background because I do think it's interesting, both this aspect of it, but then also the fact that your grandparents were actually.
What I would recommend if you basically are up in the middle of the night and can't sleep because of climate fear is you basically go back to the earliest wave of writing about the climate crisis, in the mid 90s. You could even go and rewatch that Al Gore film, An Inconvenient Truth. And you basically see the name 2020 because it's a nice round number is frequently used at this time. And you basically can see what the best climate scientists, the most prestigious climate scientists of 1995 say what is going to happen to the world in 20 or 30 years. They had a little situation down at the Embarcadero in San Francisco where someone very, very enthusiastic in like the year 2000 draw these like watermarks of like where the water would be in 2020 and like left them up indelibly and how fast would you say the oceans are rising? How many millimeters per year?
Okay, Curtis. So I know how to handle these types of discourses. I mean, if we want to get into it, yes, the oceans are not rising at some vast rate. Okay, but
What's amazing about the
I would
climate
say
crisis, what's
collapse. is occurring at a faster rate than even predicted by most climate scientists and sort of, environmentalists 20 years ago. I mean, both warming is skyrocketing, insects are gone, resources are depleting. I mean, there's massive droughts, there's massive forest fires.
So
I know you
so
sent me that thing about how hurricane damage, when you account for population, has not gotten significantly worse. I don't agree with that. I think I go with the mass, the large preponderance
so this is an
established
interesting.
climate science, which says that we are in huge problem right now, and that we don't
It
even necessarily
does. It
have a way out
does.
of it.
It does say that. It does say that. It does say that. And my problem is what I was about to explain with my mother's background is I kind of feel broadly like I know how that sausage is made and I know what's in the sausage. And and I also have, I mean, I dropped out of grad school in science. It was computer science. It was a very different field. But, I do have a sense of what American science or modern science, which is really American science, is made of and how it works. I feel like basically
Well, this is
you've
also
got a lot of
European science. John Rockstrom, these.
India. Yeah, 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 I know. It's all, but since we won the war, it's all American. I think that if you want to have this discussion, it might be more interesting too, because I feel like you have a strong attachment to it. That's fine.
I don't have an
Given,
attach. I
given,
don't have an
given,
attachment.
given, given, given your understanding, given where your information space is, you're very right to be concerned. Okay, but let me actually, note, a couple of things. One is, yes, climate science is telling you that there is a crisis, but I would just note that it's kind of an interesting kind of crisis because it's a kind of crisis where if you were not consuming media that was telling you it was happening, you would have some trouble knowing that it was happening. And that's an interesting kind of crisis. And I sort of want to hold that because there are many crises that aren't really like that.
Well,
Right.
not
And
that's not even true anymore, Curtis. I mean, just last week there were huge fires, like unprecedented drought
there
in
were
New York,
huge,
fires in Prospect Park. You could see,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
foggy.
yeah.
You could smell
You,
the wood burning. There's less
there have
insects.
like been,
Curtis, people used to drive across down the highway. Their windshields would be covered with insects. There's like zero insects anymore in their windshields. Curtis, when my mother was a kid, she could walk across the Hudson River. It was covered. It was frozen solid. When I was a kid, I could walk. I could skate on the lakes in Central Park. It's that. And now that's not even the case. They don't even freeze over. It's been
so that was the,
days in November in New York. I mean, this stuff is really happening.
I the number of times I remember I was a kid in the 70s and I
Yeah, what
remember
would it take
East
you?
Coast
What would it
climates.
take you to actually accept anthropogenic climate change as a dangerous reality?
So
What would you need to
basically, good
see?
question. Good question. So first of all, the most reliable climate records are unquestionably satellite records that are basically made by measuring microwave emissions from the top of the atmosphere. And so if you look at the two groups that have kept the satellite temperature record, which is much, much less susceptible to kind of interesting kinds of adjustments than land-based temperature records, which are can just inherently a lot more fluffy. What you see is that since the 1970s, I think the world has warmed about maybe a degree centigrade. And so
It
if
was
you
almost
basically the
1.5 last
measure
year. It was almost 1.5 last
well,
year.
so that's from the land-based temperature record, which again is a
Ocean
little.
is
So
warming
we
quicker.
can
Ocean is
call it.
warming
So
quicker.
we
Huge
can call
die-offs
it.
happening in the oceans.
We can call it 1.5. We can call, but the thing is, those huge die-offs happening in the oceans. Again, it's not like you were swimming in the ocean and they're just like, oh my God, huge die-offs. You read about it. Right. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with reading about it. There's nothing where we all read the news. We all, understand the world
I read
through the
accounts of people
giant
who go and
eye.
investigate. I read accounts of people who go and they dive into the ocean. They study the constituents of the ocean. They know how much CO2 is being absorbed by the ocean. And we're
They do.
releasing a massive. We're
They know
releasing
all.
1 million tons of CO2 into the air per hour.
They know all these things. Two things. One is that basically, did you catch any of the climate presentations at Hereticon?
I don't.
So there
I
were
saw there was something that was fossil fuel
the
presentation.
geoengineering. So the thing is, if you want to basically cool the planet, if you think that the planet is too warm, cooling it with stratospheric sulfur dioxide is incredibly cheap and easy. If you want to basically
Okay,
reduce,
now you've
uh,
switched. Now you've switched top tats because before you were saying
so
it
so
isn't
my
really a
point, yeah, yeah.
problem, and now you're saying
So
that actually we
I
probably do have to cool it down with
no, I
sulfur in the
actually
atmosphere.
I
There's
think
a
though I think
dichotomy
both
there, a switching
I
of
think
tats.
both of those I think both of those things are true. I think it's not really a problem, and I think that if we wanted to deal with it, it would be fairly
And I
straightforward. So
spoke to the nice young guys, the
here's
nice young
another
engineers who are doing the sulfur in the atmosphere project. I've also read other things about it that will cause massive disruptions in, crop rotations, Africa, plus, turning the sky a kind of dull orange. I mean, basically, people who take this stuff seriously would say that it's like, yeah, the whole planet is on the verge of a heart attack death. And, we're going to add more smog to it to try to keep industrial civilization
smog is
living,
nitrous
for
oxides
a little bit more of a time,
at smog is nitrous oxides at lower levels. There's also basically the ocean fertilization acts directly on CO2
But
by
anyway, the
removing it
only
from
reason I was bringing this
circulation.
up is I knew that
Yeah.
we disagreed. I just want to put it out there again.
So in a way, I want to like, I haven't really talked about, I accept that basically you're seeing all of these reports and they're giving you, like, I sort of want to understand, I want to explain why I basically feel that you can't trust climate science, because I think that I can explain it in terms that you'll understand.
Go for it.
Can I try that?
Yeah,
Can I try that? Can we start with virology?
sure.
Okay. So there was a nice quote from, do you know who Lena Chan is?
Yes.
She's part of the drastic open source team that was, investigating. And I think the summary of basically where COVID came from, that she came up with is, essentially that in 2018 and 2019, there were scientists in Wuhan talking about let's put a horn on a horse. And then,
Yes,
a year later,
I actually looked into that early on. I read the scientific papers from coming out of Wuhan, and I recognized that it was clearly, almost, 100% clear that that lab was taking coronaviruses from bats, adding HIV elements to them to make them more communicable to humans.
I don't know if the HIV specifically, but they were
Well, yeah,
adding the furin
HIV
cleavage
specific, I
site.
can
Yeah.
send you the paper.
Yeah. They were fucking around with it in exactly the
And
like,
it was a way
it's
for the U.S. to continue its biowarfare program, right? Because we're not allowed to
I
do
don't
anything
agree. I
illegal.
don't agree with that at all. I don't agree with that at all. My understanding of basically, it wasn't coming out of the biowarfare program. It was coming out of the Predict program run by Peter Daszak
I don't want to go down
at
this.
Eco Health
You're getting too
Alliance.
long a
In any
digression.
case, well, okay. The point is basically, here is the interesting and relevant point about this. The interesting and relevant point is that the work that was being done in Wuhan, which, the most you can say, if that wasn't a virus that leaked from this work, it was just like they were doing something insanely risky and dangerous. And then in a wild coincidence, an accident happened that was caused by something else, but looked exactly like what this risky and dangerous thing that would have caused. So the fundamental question is not, was it the risky and dangerous thing? The fundamental question is, why were they doing the risky and dangerous thing? You're with me so far?
Yes.
And the question of why they were doing the risky and dangerous thing, can be answered by actually reading their grant proposals. So if you read the proposal, this grant was turned down partly because it was, I think, embarrassing for reasons we're about to see. But they probably did the work anyway. The grant proposal which is normal in that field, the grant proposal that was closest to the work that became COVID was what was called the Defuse Protocol. And the idea,
I want to make sure we tilt back to the climate situation.
we're going to tilt back to climate. Okay. So basically, what was the defuse protocol? The defuse study was we are going to go into the bat caves of Laos and southern China. We're going to collect all of the bat coronaviruses. and we're going to mutate them to be more dangerous to humans in humanized mice. This is what they did. Okay, that's just a fact. That's what this lab program was doing. And if you ask them why they were doing this, of course, this is funded by grants. And they read a grant application. And what the grant application says is super interesting. It says, we are going to predict the emergence, and that's why it has this sort of ridiculous acronym that evaluates to the word predict. We are going to predict the emergence of these viruses. And actually, what is really amazing and what most people haven't noticed about the Fuse program is and this is just, of
We're
course,
getting to climate.
ridiculous, which is we are getting to climate. So this is maybe ridiculous, but just like what were they going to learn by predicting this? Oh, I predict that there's going to be a pandemic. Okay, does it help you fight the pandemic? No. Does it help you do anything about the pandemic? No. Actually, they had a solution to that. If you read this grant proposal, their proposal is to vaccinate all the bats in these caves against all the coronaviruses with gummies containing vaccines. Okay, this is deranged. For more reasons than like you can possibly imagine. But the thing is, the question is, why are the best virologists in the world doing this deranged stuff? Because these are the leaders of virology. That is the important question here. And I believe that answering this question has some relevance to the climate story. So, can I answer this question for you? And then we'll move it to the climate story.
Absolutely.
Here's what happened in COVID. What happened in COVID was we got SARS-1. SARS-1 was a genuine zoonosis. And if you've seen the Steven Soderbergh film Contagion, actually, people who worked on SARS-1 were technical advisors on Contagion, which is like proto-COVID in a film from like 6 years from before COVID, which is incredibly weird. But it's actually not that weird. Because what happens in SARS is here's this extremely dangerous virus. It escapes. It does exactly what they say. A bat infects a civet cat, which starts infecting people. This virus kills like 20 or 30% of the people it infects. It's really bad, but it's not very contagious. SARS-1 happens. Because SARS-1 happens, a bunch of virologists are like, hey, we've been warning for many, many years about the dangers of like virus emergence from the woods. Well, now we've shown that it can happen. It's a real thing, and the world has woken up to the threat of bat coronaviruses. So, in order to basically get funding, have you ever applied for a grant? I guess not a science grant because you're not really a science person. The structure of a grant proposal is here's a problem. Therefore, my research is important. Therefore, because it is related to the problem, therefore, you should fund my research. So, the fact that SARS-1 was a problem
It's a very
created
long
all of
digression.
these.
Very long digression. I'm still not quite seeing that.
The fact that SARS-1, we'll get there. The fact that SARS-1 was a problem created a market for grants to basically deal with this problem. But there's actually no way that virologists can deal with the problem, but they can study it. And when they study things, when they write grant proposals, everyone wants their grant to be funded. And the structure of a grant that can be funded is here is a problem of public concern. So it is a problem of public concern that bat coronaviruses could come out of the jungle. Therefore, scientists should study this. Okay, what would happen to make bat coronaviruses come out of the jungle? Well, they're bat viruses. They can't really infect humans very effectively directly, but they can mutate. Okay, well, we could sit around, let's study this process of them mutating to become more dangerous. We could sit around and wait for them to mutate, but that would take a long time. So why don't we actually try to evolve them to become more dangerous in our labs? And then we can basically evolve them to infect mice. And then we can write a paper which is truly alarming that says, hey, this bad virus out of the jungle, a few things happened to it, and it basically killed all the mice with human lungs in our study. And that's a paper that makes even more of a splash. Because your goal in science is to make a splash. Your goal in science is to basically say something important.
I get it.
Okay,
You're
let's
saying
get
that,
back to the
that there's a
climate. We're
market,
done with
there's a
COVID. We're
market for
done with
grants. You're
COVID.
saying there's a market for grants around
The
climate
market,
change.
there's a
It
market, there's a
isn't really
market for
happening. There
ideas.
isn't really a biospheric collapse. It's just that, scientists are seeing a market
There's
for.
a market, there's a market for ideas. And
Okay.
so when I look at climatology, people have been we're studying, so the Arrhenius effect, which is what we're talking about with when we talk about global warming, was discovered by the Swedish scientist, early Nobel
Not
Prize winner.
just global warming, it's the planetary boundaries. There's 9 of them. We crossed 6 of them.
I hear you. I hear you. But let's focus on global warming for the moment. So, Arrhenius discovers global warming in the 1890s. And so you find something interesting. So this effect was known throughout most of the 20th century. And you find something interesting, and that's some pretty sophisticated
Listen,
science before
listen.
1975.
I'm going to
And you
tell you
find
what
something.
I think is that this is clearly happening. I mean, there was like a 40% or 30% drop in agriculture in England alone last year because of deluges, because of flooding, and Spain's agriculture just got wiped out. These changes are happening rapidly,
So,
but
so, so
if you're holding a technologically euphoric position, you can't allow this into your consciousness because it's like it goes against this effort to create like a futuristic technophilic society that is what people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk are pushing on us. That's why they're not even
So this
talking
is
about
this is this is way before Peter Thiel and Elon Musk were born. And
it. I'm talking about
so
right
when you
now.
notice
I'm talking about now.
yeah, but I'm just basically I'm doing this thing where you basically I sort of refuse to automatically privilege right now above the past. And like that's one of our major sort of disagreements, right? And if you basically look at the way that people wrote about the Arrhenius effect in 1940 or whatever, climatology before 1970, generally speaking, had this interesting pattern where seemingly everyone who's a climatologist basically assumed that warmer is better. And so when people write about the effects of fossil fuel usage in the 1940s, they're just like, oh, yeah, and this is another great thing about burning fossil fuels, it makes the earth warmer. And when climatologists studied the history of human climates, for example, there's a period in before the Little Ice Age called the medieval warm period. But the medieval warm period was also named by these ignorant scientists. They called it the medieval climate optimum. They called it the medieval climate optimum because before people started thinking in this post 1970 kind of way, everyone who had thought about climate across history generally assumed, without even thinking about it, without even questioning the thought, they were just, well, obviously warmer is better, especially given the fact that, as you probably know, global warming is concentrated near the poles. So the places that you'll notice really that you really would have trouble avoiding noticing global warming, or you wouldn't pinch yourself to say, is this real? If you live in Nome, Alaska, you're not pinching yourself to say, is this real? Because in Nome, Alaska, the climate change is not 4 degrees centigrade, is not 1 degree centigrade, it's more like three. I don't know the number, but it's higher. And it's something that's very unambiguously notable in Nome, Alaska. Of course, if you're in Nome, Alaska, you don't spend a lot of time thinking, wow, I wish the
Okay,
world
cool.
was
I'm glad
colder.
we're agreeing that anthropogenic climate change is happening.
So when we basically look at what is truly remarkable about the feeling of, yeah, I'm what's called a lukewarmer. I mean, I don't know how you would define, I don't know how you would deny the like physics, right? It's more a question of the physics on the very, very complicated system that Earth is Earth's atmosphere. So if you look at, for example, if you want to look for like a climate scientist that I, really respect, it would be someone like, say, Judith Curry, who ran the Georgia Tech Climate Center for many, many years. And so if you can't sleep at night, read some Judith Curry. But in any case, my point is that when you look at the information market, the thing that jumps out at me about the market, the way in which the market for information about climate
Just a quick.
changed. Wait, I'm almost done with this. I'm almost done. Please let me finish. The thing is, what changes, in this sort of post-Earth Day environment for the market for climate studies is basically that there is a very large market today for climate studies about this is a bad thing, or this is important, or the impact of this is very large. There is basically no market for studies, that are like increasing carbon dioxide is increasing crop yield or something. Nobody cares. Nobody gives a rat's ass. Nobody gets excited about it at all, and so what you see is this, we live, and this is, if there's one idea that I want to like get across to like my like fellow liberals, because as I said, I too grew up listening to NPR. If there's one idea I want to get across to kind of my cultural liberals and libertarians, actually, because both liberals and libertarians have this kind of naive belief in like especially Elon Musk. Sorry, I was about to use a curse word, but especially Elon Musk has a big belief in the marketplace of ideas. And if you believe in the marketplace of ideas, you're basically like, in the marketplace of ideas, people love truth and they hate lies and it outcompete lies. And I'm just like, I don't think that that's actually the way it works in the real world. I think that there's a lot of evolutionary forces in marketplaces of ideas, and I've just described the force of evolution that made virologists believe that they should inflict like a pandemic on the world, which is like the opposite of what virology is supposed to be for.
So yeah, I mean, I would just
And
say, do I get a chance to speak next? It's been a very long digression.
yes, yes. Do you understand the point that I'm trying to make about
I
marketplaces of
completely disagree. I
ideas?
completely disagree with you. I think that we're in an emergency, biospheric emergency situation.
I understand
I
that.
think
I
the evidence is
understand that. I understand
incontrovertible.
that. But
I
just so
think
I
that we're
understand
seeing
that, but
whole
the
countries
point about the
collapse.
way,
We're seeing massive droughts. We're seeing deluges. We're seeing huge changes to, you know, systems, like, and we're seeing, and that's the point that I was trying to make before, is the rise of right-wing populism, which I see as a terrible phenomenon you seem to like,
Mhm.
leading to somebody like Donald Trump demonizing illegal immigrants, creating camps on the southern border to potentially do whatever they want to these people. That is all linked to this biosphere collapse that's taking place. It's linked to why food prices are going up. Agriculture is getting harder to sustain, and food is becoming more expensive. Resources are depleting. This is actually happening. People are moving north because their whole countries are breaking down. On my corner, there's a processing center for asylum seekers, for refugees. I saw these long lines of black young men there. It's like,
Is this in New
where are these
York?
guys
Is
coming
this
from? Let me talk for a second. Where are these
okay?
guys coming? Let me talk for a second. Ivory Coast, okay? What's happening in Ivory Coast right now? 50% of the world's chocolate is grown in Ivory Coast, okay? Three companies, well, Nestle's and Hershey's are the main companies there. They've worked with the, I'm sure, despotic government, which is hyper corrupt. 80% of the country is deforested at this point. Those people are fleeing a collapsing country. That a combination of our climate change that we've emitted through our stuff, and our corporations and their exploitative practices have made these societies untenable for many people. Syria, where they're just basically, the Europe is just not even taking their boats anymore, letting those people die at sea because they don't want to deal with it. So for me, this is like, yeah, that is what's happening, and that's also leading to this right-wing populist movement. Now, I want to get into a few other topics with you. One is, you've said some things that I know they were joking, but I found very disturbing. For instance, you talked about,
Mm.
turning the underclass to biodiesel, or
You have to understand. I'm sorry. That was basically being. I really try not to be a trollish philosopher. But sometimes I go over the limit. Actually, I wasn't proposing turning the underclass into biodiesel. I was basically trying to separate the externalities that not even the under was multiple kinds of what things we mean when we say underclass. I was trying to separate basically what is humanitarian treatment of these people with the externalities that they inflict on others. And my point there was essentially that if you look at basically what is the most compassionate way. So if you go to San Francisco, for example, you'll see you have this huge enabling industry that, loves to give addicts like fentanyl
whatever has
shooting rigs, right?
happened with this
And
insane drug addiction, fentanyl stuff is obviously horrific and reprehensible.
So when I look at it's horrific and reprehensible, and I think that basically it stems from a kind of loss of kind of the understanding of the state as in loco parentis in a way, because it's absolutely clear if you talk to any specialist what these people need, they need to be put in like kind of in care groups that are very, very far from any of these stimuli that they get, and they need to kind of have their life rebuilt in like small caring. Like there's a really good when my wife passed, I was like, if you want to give charitable donations, give them to this organization in San Francisco called Delancey Street. And Delancey Street is an amazing organization, and everyone who works at Delancey Street, except the director, Mimi, I forget her name, is a former street bum. Everyone who works there is a former street bum. They don't take government money. And what you do when you enter Delancey Street is you surrender your freedom completely. And you're basically like, I have fucked up my life completely. And I am not, in charge. And therefore, you will tell me what to do. You will give me a job. You will tell me like who I can date and not date. You will take a kind of almost what you might say totalitarian control of my life. And for someone who is on the street, that's exactly what they need. For you and me, no, that's not exactly what they need. But for someone who's on the street, basically, liberty is a curse to these people.
But
And it is also a curse to the people around them who get their car windows broken on a regular basis. So I have a good.
I do think that you and I probably have different perspectives on the origin of these problems and also what exacerbates it. So, for instance, profit-seeking, corporations like the one run by the Sacklers, which earn a huge amount
Can
of
I
money
recommend
from
another?
fentanyl.
Can I recommend another guest to you?
Yeah.
I would love it. I think you would have a great conversation with my friend Jared Klickstein,
Okay, cool. Anybody
who
you
just
recommend, I'll
published.
do. By the way, I really appreciate so much that you're willing to have this conversation with me. It means a lot to me. I'm very grateful actually that you're this open. And I actually do feel that you have kind of like a good heart. Like I feel like you have a sort of like a personal
I
warmth and
just
generosity. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your willingness to have this kind of dialogue with me. Now, I do want to get into something though, which we discussed a little bit in our text exchanges around
Mhm.
your perspective is that people, you said people should either work or not eat. Okay. Now I want to just talk a little bit about that, in terms of this, technocratic corporation, which our civilization would become, that sounds pretty strict and strident. And I'm also kind of curious with you. We talked about legitimation before. What legitimates
So
a contemporary post-industrial dictatorship if it's not anything having to do with anything religious or spiritual or metaphysical, if it's simply power for power's sake and no law, above that, I don't see where the legitimation comes from. And I don't see from your perspective as an atheist why you give a crap if people work or if they just, look at the daisies or, write poetry all day.
Well, I don't want them burning my house down. And but I think this is, this question of I think that, we're in some of the most interesting terrain of the conversation here, to be honest. And I think that it has an interesting, yeah, it's a fascinating conversation because I think that, one of the things that there are many beliefs that we almost all share today that someone from almost any period in history would just find just not only bizarre, but just like self-evidently insane. And so one of the things that basically, you know, I think very strongly, and I think we discussed this a little in our text exchange. It was about Maslow's pyramid of needs. And you, of course, are a burner. You've been to Burning Man several times. And
18
for
times I
me,
went to that place.
18 time, very powerful. And I heard this was the first year they didn't sell out of tickets. So maybe there's some kind of decline. The Zoomers laugh at my reverence for Burning Man. I'm very like, I can't help but be impressed by the Church of Burning Man, right? It's an amazing phenomenon. And the thing is basically Burning Man is a festival for people at the top of the pyramid of Maslow's pyramid of needs. They are all going there for self-actualization. They are not going there because they are thirsty. They're not going there because they are hungry or cold. They will be all of these things out on the fucking playa, right? But that's okay because it's a place where not only are they there for self-actualization, everyone else there is there for self-actualization because no one would frankly go to this godforsaken place for any other reason. And if you imagine holding Burning Man in Fort Lauderdale, or even on, say, Jeffrey Epstein's island, someplace nice, you quickly see why it's absolutely necessary for, Burning Man to be in the Black Rock Desert, which is, let's face it, a shithole. Although, frankly, one knows if you ever want to tease Elon Musk or Elon supporters, just tell them that if Mars was on Earth, it would be by far the worst place on Earth. And it would be worse than Camden, New Jersey, and certainly worse than the Black Rock Desert. And but the thing is, when you go to Burning Man, you notice a couple of things. One is that, again, all of these people are at the top of Maslow's pyramid of needs. And for me, that's really what defines an aristocrat and an aristocracy. If you look, for example, if you go back even to early communism, leftism has always been an aristocratic movement, in my view. There was never an idyllic period when it came up from the bottom. It always comes down from the top. And so you see, for example, Trotsky writing about the new Soviet man. And he's basically like, he has this famous passage where he's like, ordinary humans will rise to the level of a Newton or an Einstein. And above those peaks, new heights will rise, right? Incredible, right? And then you look at the fucking Soviet Union and you're like, well, that was a shit show, and this sort of comes from this basically, like, ultimately the kind of the dream of the 20th century noble is that the way we sort of heal the world is to make everyone into nobles like us. And so this feeling of like we are going to make, and I remember believing this so strongly as a kid. I believe that through education, we could make the planet into a world of like Burning Man dwelling nobles. And then you go to Burning Man, and how's the racial diversity at Burning Man, Daniel? Is it strong? Is it not so strong? How would you compare it to the average Klan rally? Especially these days, the Klan is pretty debased. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw, more, and what's astounding, given the proximity to Silicon Valley, is that you might say the demographics of Burning Man are the same as the demographics of Google, but it's really not so because basically you'll see a lot more Chinese and Indian people at Google than at Burning Man. At Burning Man, it's basically like frighteningly white, and so you're just like, that's like, really something. And then you're just like, I had this you know, in any case, what you're looking at Burning Man, and I think if you were to take a like 14th century Italian noble in his like beautiful brocade coat and with his rapier and whatever, reader of Castiglione's the courtier, I guess 15th century, even 16th century, he would recognize the burners often with also their very own elaborate costumes. He would recognize the burners as fellow aristocrats. Castiglione would say, well, this is very fucked up and very weird, but these men are as dedicated to self, and women are as dedicated to self-perfection as the courtiers of ancient Italy. In a different way, they are, but they are. And so, when I basically look at, for example, one of the proposals to like fix this awful economic system that we live in, which, I can call it capitalism or whatever, but it fucking sucks, right? Is, for example, the proposal of universal basic income. And, whenever I sort of argue with a UBI proponent, I have a number of bits that I do. And one of my bits is the Jane Austen bit because I'm like, if you've ever read any Jane Austen, you know exactly the best case scenario for basic income. And they're just like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I'm like, well, Mr. Darcy, he's got a UBI. He's got £1,000 a year. He didn't do anything to deserve that money. That's a UBI, basically. And one of the kind of traditional definitions of nobility is basically a noble is somebody who doesn't work, who has a UBI. And so when you basically look at,
I think I mentioned to you before one of my favorite essays and sort of a exemplary of maybe my political philosophy is Oscar Wilde's "The Soul of Man Under Socialism."
yeah, 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 yeah.
Basically, and he foresaw a future where humans would be liberated by machines to do what he felt was our I might have a slightly different perspective, but his thing was cultivated leisure. That more
Yeah,
people
yeah,
would
yeah,
be
yeah.
poets,
Otium,
more people would
otium,
be artists.
As the
They don't have the
Latin
time.
aristocrat
They don't have
said,
the leisure to
as
cultivate their unique individuality, and
as the
therefore they
Latin.
develop a lot of anger against those who do.
That's right. And there's only one problem with that, which is that it's sort of, do you know what a skyhook is logically? It's like basically if you have like one fallacious statement, like 2 + 2 = 5, if you assume that 2 + 2 = 5, you can construct this enormous world of like fantasy mathematics on the theory that 2 + 2 = 5. Similarly, if there's a statement that a lot of Americans believe. Or a lot of people, or most people around the world believe today, and it's a very old line. It's all men are created equal. And I'm like, let's evaluate the truth of that statement for the moment. Shall we dare to evaluate the truth of it? And one of the things that basically, if you're evaluating the
Well, I
truth
mean,
of the
I would
statement,
say
one of the
from
wait. Can I finish my bit? It's a bit. This is a short bit. It's a
these
short bit.
bits are
Okay.
long, Curtis.
So this is a short. I'm doing the weave. This is Trump's America. I'm doing the weave. This is not even the weave. It's a bit. It's a single bit. It's not even woven. Right. So, and here in Trump's America, we do the weave. We're going to make America weave again. And see, and so, one of the things about truth is that basically there's a kind of backdoor way to identify an untruthful statement, which is simply that you can make it truer. If you can make any statement truer, then maybe it's not completely true. And so when I take the statement that all men are created equal, and I'm like, how would I make that? Okay, it's clearly some metaphysical sense there, but like objectively, how would I make that truer? And I was just like, well, what if I were to say, in this house, we believe that all identical twins are created equal. And I do believe that all identical twins are created equal in a much sort of deeper sense than the belief that all men are created equal. And so the thing is, if you basically believe, and I used to believe, there's this sort of, if you know the Thomas Gray Elegy in a Country Churchyard, poem, I used to believe very, very strongly that the kind of pre-modern world was basically full of like kind of frustrated geniuses who could have been Einstein, but instead they spend all day plowing a field for 40 years and then die. Or they could have been Shakespeare or whatever and whatever. And that assumption
Those are
that
not my assumptions, by
basically,
the way. Those are not my assumptions.
okay. So the thing is, if those are not your assumptions, basically, you kind of have to admit that
I mean, what I would
the
say is that
average
mhm. Is the bit over?
the
Like,
average the average planetary IQ is something like 85. It's
mhm.
not even 90. It's like 85. And so, I don't know that you spend a lot of time dealing with people with an IQ of 85 or even frankly 115. I'd say 115 is almost kind of out of your social circle. But 85 is kind of something else. And the thing is, when you're thinking about a human being with an IQ of 85, you have to recognize both that this person is not the same as you in many senses, and that he is also truly human in other senses. And so, your question of basically what is the right way for this person to live? What is the way for this person to
Was that my
live
question?
that it's my question. So let me answer it. The question of like what is, because it came back to like, you should be working to eat or whatever. The question of what this sort of the way that an ordinary, normal human being, lovable in all the ways that humans are lovable, should live. Basically, what we see is that if we basically, when we're looking at nobles, we're looking at people who are the result of a lot of selective breeding of various kinds. They're really unusual tomatoes. Not all tomatoes are created equal. These are really unusual tomatoes. When you take a tomato, and there's a lot in this world besides IQ. IQ isn't everything by any means. Our
Correct.
brains are really, really complicated things. And but when you take someone who
Yeah, well, that is
is,
kind of like I would say one of my critiques of some of your way of thinking is a what's the right word? Amplification of IQ and intellect as something that is good in and of itself. I mean, I would say, yeah. I mean,
yeah,
let
I
me just
wouldn't,
let me just finish for a second. You never let me talk
okay,
even for a second without cutting me off.
I'm sorry,
So
I'm terrible.
like our bodies have a lot of different types of cells. We have liver cells,
Mhm.
we have brain cells, we have heart cells, we have skin cells. There is a differentiation in the human community. We all are created equal. A skin cell is just as wonderful as a heart cell. It needs
Yeah.
energy, it needs care, it needs love. It maybe need a different type
It's
of
just
care and love.
it needs a different, that's exactly right. It needs a
Yes.
different kind of, and the thing is you're really unlikely to be able to take, or at least all efforts to basically take, say, not even non-European populations, but like pre-industrial populations. Like you take like Brazilian Indians from
I
the
think that there,
Amazon.
you and I have some difference of opinion, and that I don't think we know at this point what's nurture and what's nature from a very early age, and what are kind of like, how people are so even at a, given expectations or ideas about what they can be, even maybe in the fucking womb. I mean, these things
I
happen,
think if it was
you
possible,
know.
I think if it was possible for the magic of education
Yeah.
to turn gypsies into Jews, we'd probably know.
Well, actually,
And and
I disagree with you, Chris. I mean, there was one kind of I can look it up. I'll try to find it in your terms. There was a rich man who graduated from a very, deprived high school, I think in the South Bronx or something. He made a fortune, and many years later he came back and he was like, okay, I'm going to take that the earliest class, maybe it was kindergarten, and anybody, because it's like I think they had a dropout rate of like 90% or something, and he's like, any kid who makes it all the way through high school and graduates, I will give them a full college scholarship. Okay. And instead of it being like a 10%, graduation rate, it was like a 95% graduation rate. And not only did it pull up that class, it pulled up the other classes before and after, because everybody suddenly saw there was a possibility to escape this fucking nightmare, that they were trapped in.
well,
So I
yeah, I
think that
mean,
actually there's a lot more possibility that humans have than you may be giving them credit for coming out of the go back to the Solzhenitsyn line, you know.
yeah, I think that if you look at
And if you want me to find that study for you, I'll
efforts,
hunt it down.
yeah, yeah, I mean, I like, I mean, you know, actually, college, graduating from high school today is something that really a hardworking person with an 80 or 85 IQ is very much capable of, and even going to college. That says, actually, I think in some ways more about what we've turned education into than, which is a strange, strange thing by historical standards. But in terms of when you're looking for effects of impacts that basically raise intelligence, people have looked for that holy grail very, very, very hard in a lot of the places that it might be found. And you kind of have to admit that it might not be there. And if you admit that it might not be there, then you might need a system that was designed for basically
A lot of
ordinary
mites. That's a lot
humans
of
with an
mites.
IQ. You might need a
You
system.
might.
Well,
There's a lot of things you might need it.
because you might need a system, you might actually want to at least think about the
You
problem.
might. You might not.
It's
You
worth,
might find that people have a lot more possibility if they have hope and if they have something to aspire to, that actually that moves a society in a completely different direction. And if you look at societies like, I know you don't like to talk about various indigenous societies or say Indo-Tibetan societies, people were not garbage. The lowest common person was fully contributing to that society. It's only this
that's what's
society that
important.
discards people, okay, that treats them like garbage,
That's what's
that
important.
denies their humanity.
That's what's important.
This
That's
society
what's
creates
important.
these
We're
kind
agreeing
of drug
vehemently. We're
addicted
yelling at each
failures.
other.
You're
We're
not letting me
yelling at
finish
each
my
other because
statements.
we
You're
agree.
talking
We
over me over and
agree.
over again. You're not letting me finish my statements. I'm letting you speak at great length, and you're not letting me finish my statements.
I'm agreeing with you vehemently.
Okay,
Okay,
cool.
and sorry, that doesn't really
Let's move to another
that
topic
doesn't
then.
That's works. And wait. This is a hugely important topic. Like, I want to explore that agreement. It's really important, right? Because the thing is basically, the idea of treating large percentage of the population as human garbage is not present in the world in the pre like revolutionary world. That is not an idea that they have. That is absolutely not an idea that they have. And that is just not the way it's done. And the thing is, when you look at, for example, let's look at, one of the things that, though many of us, like, of course, we see like heredity working in our daily lives. Our smart friends have smart kids, and but we all know like people who are like in the smart tier of society or whatever, whose parents are just like these like really ordinary average people. We know that it's not deterministic like that. Like there are these weird, smart people have stupid kids, stupid people have smart kids. It happens. And peasants have smart kids. And what would happen basically? So, for example, Cardinal Wolsey, who was basically Henry VIII's prime minister, and you're just like, oh my God, there can't be any social mobility in the world of Henry VIII, who cuts the heads off his wives.
But
Cardinal
I just
Wolsey
want
was
to,
the son of
time
a
out for one
butcher.
second, Curtis.
Okay.
Time out for one second. I just want to say that, like, America under the flawed democratic constitutional republic that we had, from the 1930s till maybe January 5th, when this idiot gets fucking inaugurated, was an incredible meritocracy. And the reason for that is because it actually tried to provide for people. That the tax rate on the wealthiest members of society in the 1950s and 60s was over 90%. So the whole idea was
Hmm.
to take that money and put it back into social services so that everybody had access to public education, social services, healthcare. And it was only in after the 60s when you had, right-wing libertarians like the Koch brothers decided they hated this model of society. They didn't want people to have that kind of opportunity. They didn't want to have, movements of civil rights. They didn't want to have ecological movements. They went after, if you read Dark Money by Jane Mayer, it was a 35-year plan to destroy these institutions, to create their intellectual armatures, to foreground figures like Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve, to create the Heritage Foundation, to create this situation we have now, where due to the poisonous effect of right-wing media, we have a brainwashed, one-third of the
Have
population.
you read? Have you ever read a book by Charles Murray? I'd recommend not
I
The
did
Bell
actually.
Curve. Which one? I would
Bell
recommend
Curve.
Losing Ground.
Bell Curve.
No, yeah, the Bell Curve is not a bad book, but really what you should read is Losing Ground. And so the thing is, if you look at basically, spending per student in, for example, inner city school districts, it is not low. It is actually very, very high. And the results of that very, very high spending, which were touted at one time. I mean, this project of basically leveling society up in many senses is basically this kind of spectacular 20th century project. And I feel that a lot of the reasoning behind it comes really, frankly, from the experience of our ancestors,
Would you
namely
say that the
like
increasing centralization of wealth in fewer and fewer hands? I mean, Zuckerberg alone is worth more than 10% of millennials in the US. Would you say that is a problem?
Uh, what problems does that problem cause?
Huge problems. It creates huge social inequality, huge wealth inequality, and most people are being starved of possibility because the wealth is concentrated in such fewer and fewer hands.
So I would say that starving of possibility is a very interesting problem. I don't know that the problem
Most
of
kids in their 20s and
having,
30s don't even imagine they're going to own a house. They're not getting married. They
oh,
don't even
I
believe
know.
they're ever going to have anything like their parents or grandparents did. The effect of wealth concentration has been to cut off the future of all these people, and they're just walking around having no clue about how to live in this society.
I I agree with that. I see that completely. I think that there are other economic analyses that are neither Marxist nor libertarian that I don't think you're particularly familiar with that basically, would cover that a little better. I think I recommended when we talked earlier the Victorian thinker John Ruskin. I think you'd basically find I think there's something in Ruskin that would really,
Well,
because
Curtis, I will.
when you talk
I
about,
have been following your reading list, and even I picked up a bunch of books, and I will keep doing it. And we can meet again. I'd love it if you read some of the ones that I
can
proposed, including my books,
we
because I think
can
we
we
have a
can
fun,
we can we
back and
can
forth.
we can
But I liked
it would be a
Fusco du Calange. I got interested in him.
Fusel de Calange. Did you enjoy? Did you read all of the
I,
Ancient City?
I didn't read all of it yet. I mean, my God, my eyes are falling out of my head
Yeah.
with all the reading lists. But I'm interested. You mentioned some French
Well, I mentioned
revolutionaries.
Ruskin. I
Yeah,
mentioned
I'm
Ruskin
open.
for a reason. I mentioned
I
Ruskin. I
like the fact that
mentioned
you're introducing me to thinkers that I don't know yet, and I hope that I can do the same with you. And I've actually suggested a few that I thought might be helpful for expanding the parameter of your worldview a little bit if you're open to it.
I certainly am. And I mentioned Ruskin, although, there's a bit of an asymmetry because you sort of can't help in our society and sort of being kind of deeply steeped in progressive thought. It's kind of all around you, even if you're an opponent of it. Whereas it's relatively rare to be steeped in kind of anti-progressive thought. And it was just like discovering like a series of marvels to me when I started to discover kind of right-wing thought beyond
Since I don't know
libertarians.
Ruskin yet, it's not going to be that helpful, I think, and I don't think the
Okay,
audience.
so
I want
Ruskin.
to bring up one
So
more
the thing
thing. I
that's
want to
really
bring up one
important.
more topic before maybe we fold up for
Okay,
today because it's been like 2.5 hours.
okay,
Okay.
that's fine. That's fine.
So, in
Yes.
terms of moving towards a technocratic monarchy, where you have a CAO in charge of corporation America, producing, I'm not sure what, I guess security at the price of freedom would be my perspective. Do you think that Elon Musk is seeking to make himself that figure? Do you think that is his
No,
plan here?
no, no. I think that actually, far from it. Elon Musk has very little understanding of how the federal government works. I think that he sort of wants to repair and kind of. I think he's a libertarian, and the thing is, as a libertarian, I think that sort of
Hold on a
people
second.
who are
People talk about Peter Thiel and Elon Musk as libertarians. These guys have massively benefited from government subsidies, from working hand in hand with different administrations. I mean, I don't see how they might have a libertarian kind of idealism, but in actuality, they're completely down and dirty with whatever they need to do to accomplish their wealth hoarding goals.
Well, I mean, they live in the real world. They pay their taxes. I mean,
Less and less
and
of
Musk
them.
is not. Musk is not a well, Peter Thiel has the world's greatest Roth IRA, as you may know, but
I know
the
about that.
yeah, you have to be impressed by that. But they're very different figures to like to sort of conflate, Thiel and Musk is, the thing that I always
I'm
want to
sure
explain to.
I know, and I like, we can go into that, but I just want to
Yeah.
confirm. I'm sure you know that Elon Musk's grandfather was part of this Technocracy Inc. And,
Oh yeah, the 30s technocracy it has no relationship with anything now. It's
well, it
really
does
like
have
a
a
New
lot of
Deal.
relationship with things now because it really does look like, if you were to look at it from a certain perspective, that looks like what he's trying to do. You
Yeah,
basically,
it's
you
a
have a
like
Eurasian
completely.
technocrat, and you have an American technocrat that goes from Mexico through Canada. Then if you have a ruler of that one, and then you have a ruler of Putin is
This
the
is
ruler of the
ins
Eurasian one. It looks like that's what they're
this is
kind of like
ins
lining up for in a way.
this is insane 1930s shit. I mean, if I were to show you like a book of like Technocracy Inc., which was a thing, it was first of all, it was a liberal thing. It was a technocracy. The original technocracy movement was very much, there were little echoes of it in the New Deal. It was very much a
But
movement
also,
of
it's an
the
anti-democratic
progressive
model.
left.
It's a rule by tech by
It's a
engineers and scientists, right? There's no democracy in that model.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, when you basically go back to, rule by engineers and scientists, consider the fact that all of climate science is telling you there's a climate crisis, and a bunch of housewives on Facebook are telling you there's no climate crisis. And the housewives, for some reason, can outvote the scientists. That's democracy. So the thing is, if you basically want like to respect engineers and scientists and let them run things, and I think that there are significant problems with that approach. as which is sort of where we were going when we were talking about virology and climate science. I think there are very significant problems with that approach. Do I believe, like the way Elon Musk does in Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God, the voice of Facebook is the voice of God, the voice of upvotes is the voice of God? No, I don't believe that the voice that the voice of upvotes is the vote of God. I really do not believe that. I would be happy to debate Elon Musk on that subject. I have, and so I'm like, actually, if you see populism, what you often see in conflicts, and maybe this is a note that we could close on because I think what you often see in historic conflicts as well as personal conflicts. You've probably seen, the couple who fights all the time, and you look at these people and you're just like, the worst part of it is each of them is right about the other. And, when I look at basically red versus blue America, I'm just like, there's a whole bunch of things I disagree with. And there's a different, I really believe in that you should be as reverent in the face of history as if you were within a great temple or cathedral, right? And I really like with the Bannon and Posobiec book that you talked about, earlier, I was just like, that's not the dude, right? It's not the vibe. Um, and yet, basically, when I look at red versus blue America, I can't help but avoid the feeling that there are many very deep senses in which each side is right about the other. And that's why, basically, when you sort of, to sort of bring it around to the opening, I'm just like, actually being like fully pilled is like very depressing. Like, it's really pretty depressing to look at this American political conflict and be like, the real problem is that each side is right about the other. They're not right in all details. They're like, but they're kind of like, they're directionally right. I would say that each side is kind of directionally right about the other, even if they're wrong in sort of many, many details. And so I would say, for example, that your analysis of like why libertarianism isn't the thing or doesn't work, I would say in the details, it's almost wholly wrong. But the thing is, in terms of your sense of like, this is not an economy that is humane, that is working for people, that actualizes people to whatever level they're capable of being actualized, or that has a place that's human for every human being within them. This, I think, Hillary Clinton's politics of meeting. Let's go back to the politics of meeting. Hillary was right about that, right? This is not like that sense of enemy, like that sense that this is not, even for its upper classes, this isn't working, right? Never forget the like fentanyl wilderness of Ohio. Even from the upper class, it's just like, Jesus Christ, applying to fucking college. Can you believe what that shit is like now? It's incredible. It's mind-bogglingly, it's insane. And so like this is not a working system. And yet basically when you look at the like critiques, it's like you look at like QAnon, right? And QAnon's view of the deep state is just this wild fantasy by like some like weird sex criminal in the Philippines or something. I don't know who Q is, but like, it's this ridiculous
Michael
thing, right?
Flynn. Michael
And
Flynn
yet
is basically who people think Q is.
it's not Michael Flynn, but like, oh my God, it's not Michael Flynn. But like, I can't use that word on your show, but it's like basically, it's like it is not mentally stable, and yet, and it is certainly not true, and yet, when you kind of step back and look at it, you're just like, maybe the real truth about Washington is so much deeper and more weirder and more horrifying. But there's an element in which you're kind of getting it right? It's just like you're completely at the lunch as far as all the details of reality, and you don't provide an alternative that is viable in any way, shape, or form. You can't. Elon Musk doesn't have an alternative that is viable in any way, shape, or form. Elon Musk does not agree with me about all this monarchy bullshit. Like, let's be perfectly clear about that, right? And the he's not just pretending to be a 1990s libertarian. He is a 1990s libertarian, and that's why he's going to fail. And the like, and then so it's like and similarly, like when you look at like the COVID lab leak, this just like the reality that like we trusted and funded these scientists to protect us from viruses, and they wound up inflicting these viruses on us, is like true. Now, was it a biowarfare experiment? Was it this? Was it no? It was just human stupidity. They didn't mean to do it, but it was just inevitable that they would do it. But it was just the system was so stupid that they wound up doing it. And so you're
Chris,
just
I'm
like,
trying to give you the last word. You got to wind up a little bit.
okay, and so when you have this kind of, when you're looking for what historians will think of our period in 100 years, I don't think they'll be Republicans or Democrats. I think they'll be able to kind of pull this back and kind of see red and blue for kind of what they are in the moments that they are. And like, whenever we look at history, it looks
I hope we.
grievously
I
blinded.
personally hope we survive 100 years. Um,
Well, you and I are not going to survive 100 years. I can tell you that
well,
pretty
why can't we? Can't
confidently.
we take the telomerase, virgin blood, transfusion, nutraceuticals,
Yeah,
all that
yeah,
stuff?
yeah. You sound super optimistic the way you're laughing about this. Like, well, at least you got your teeth replaced. I should do that. And the it sucks being old, man. But yeah,
It actually sucks worse being young somehow.
I don't know. Ideally there's some combination that could be found. But
Listen,
all right,
Curtis,
I've
I've
delayed
been.
we've delayed each other too long, but I think we had some fun here, and I think
Yeah,
we laid down some
I think
good
what we should
tracks.
do. I would enjoy doing this with you. If you're up for it. Well, first, I have this young guy who I think would be interesting to talk to you if he wants to. Might be fun, but also I think it would be fun for us to choose like two or three texts, have the other person read those books, then we come back and we're like, boom, we have like a little more frame of
That would
reference.
be that would be an interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for making.
I like that you like the ancient city. It's a
Oh yeah,
really
no,
like
I'm
it's
fascinated by
a
all these books. I mean, I like, I'm a big fan of Julius Evola. I like to explore this. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
also, I
yeah.
want to
The
work on
cult
your
of
atheism next time, so we can
You
get
can
around that.
work on you can work on my atheism. It's a much less atheistic than most people's atheism.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. You've
there's
given me some
that. So
hints of that
yeah,
too.
yeah,
That's for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
All
yeah,
right, buddy.
yeah.
Have
All
a
right,
great
all
day.
right,
Thank you for the time.
all right,
Yeah.
all right, all right. It's a pleasure.
Okay.
All right, take care. Bye.